why is Saladin still such a talked about figure so many years after his death?
He is a hero for the Muslim world and also for his enemies as well, which makes him quite a remarkable figure
Mm.
because he had qualities of leadership. I should say that it was his leadership qualities that attracted me to him in the first place. I'd done a book on the leadership of Genghis Khan and a biography of Genghis Khan, and I was interested to know if there were other people who would match Genghis's character. And Saladin seemed to do that in a most remarkable way, which is why I turned to him. Not because I speak Arabic or have an expertise in Arabic history, but his leadership qualities are things is what really marks him out for both the Muslim world and the English-speaking world.
Mm. And what are like a few leadership characteristics that you see in both of those characters?
Well, I think the most astonishing thing is, believe it or not, humility. That is that they were both marked out. They both regarded themselves as being marked out for great things. Genghis in terms of founding a nation and an empire, and Saladin for uniting the Muslim world and driving out the Crusaders. And these were big visions. And that was the first great thing in a leader is to have a vision of what you want to achieve. And then, of course, comes the character of actually being able to achieve it.
What I found really remarkable while reading your book is how he was able to unite both Muslim parties, the Shias and the Sunnis. That's something only like a real leader is able to do, right?
Yes, the unity of Sunni and Shia is a remarkable achievement. He was himself a Sunni and came from the eastern part of the Muslim world, and the Shia were ruling in Egypt, and they were um, obviously rivals for centuries, and they can't be fully reconciled. But what Saladin had going for him was a mutual enemy, and great leaders need powerful enemies so that they can focus the attention of their people on that on the achievement of that vision of conquest. For some time now, for a century now, since his birth in the late 12th century, he had an enemy in terms of the presence of the Crusaders, who had come to the Holy Land, as they called it, the Holy Land, in order to take back Jerusalem from Muslim power and retrieve it for the Christians. And they had set up in the First Crusade in 1099 an enclave in what is now Israel and southern Syria and Lebanon. These Christian entities were the focus for Saladin's efforts to drive them into the sea, as he put it, and to do that, he needed the unity of Shia and Sunni, and without that powerful enemy, I don't think he'd have been able to do it.
How was he able to like unite them like communication wise? Did he have like any like is it mostly just the one common enemy or did he have any other tricks up his sleeve to be able to unite them?
Well, I mean, one interesting thing for me was to discover exactly how he was able to communicate. Ostensibly, all you've got is a galloping horse, and that's the speed with which you can send a message. But that's not quite true, because across the medieval world, there was a whole industry which is very little known, namely pigeon post. The link can be made as long as you have an industry of pigeon fanciers who have got trained pigeons who can take the pigeons back and forth with the armies and release them when necessary with messages on their feet, so that it was possible. For instance, one of the Shia sultans in Egypt to have fresh cherries delivered from 600 miles away almost overnight by teams of pigeons with cherries attached to their feet. Now, if you replace the cherries with messages, you can get a message across the Middle East in a day. And this was what allowed him to communicate so effectively between the most distant parts of his empire.
Hmm. Yeah, I found that was one of the most fascinating parts. Even though the battles were super interesting, but that part in the book, I kind of like didn't realize like what type of network and type of training that must have been needed and able to like all send all those pigeons all around the world. And the amount of percentage of those pigeons that died too, that's like incredible.
Well, of course, you lose a pigeon now and then when they're flying 600 miles. So what you do is duplicate. And this was the sort of mini internet of its time, made by not AI, but by pigeons. And it lasted for centuries and was so routine that very few people actually mentioned it and or the significance of it. And of course, there were even pigeons being used up until the First World War, until the telegraph really took over. So it was absolutely crucial and very little known.
Fascinating. And there's one thing to like unite the people, but another thing what I wonder is how was he able to like keep them loyal the to Muslims parties?
The loyalty, well, it's absolutely crucial. And it goes back to his character. He was a generous-hearted person, and as well as being ruthless, which one needs to be in that sort of military leadership, he was generous both to his allies and his enemies as well. And this gained him a tremendous reputation for mercifulness, which of course is an Islamic virtue, and kept his people loyal. Loyalty also depended on having a shared vision, and his vision was so powerful to drive the Crusaders into the sea that everyone was united behind him.
You just mentioned Islamic virtue. How much did that play a role in his style of leadership?
Islamic virtues were terribly important to him because he was totally committed to Islam and to the virtues of Islam. Now, in the Quran, you can as in all great religions, you can get anything you want from the holy book, and there's a lot of xenophobia in both the Bible and in the Quran, but there is also much goodness. And he was able to focus on this and take all the virtues of Islam and turn them to his benefit and gain loyalty from them.
And I could understand like because he is someone who aspired for a certain amount of greatness that it could become frustrating, right? Like people not following along. Do we see any moments in his life where he kind of loses his sense for Muslim virtue? He loses his sense of patience and mercifulness.
Well, the big occasion on which he would not show any mercy was to his principal enemy, who was called Raynald of Chatillon in France, one of the many Chatillons in France. This one was from somewhere up on the Seine, and Raynald came to the Middle East, came to the Holy Land, in order really to create mayhem. He was the most evil character you can imagine. The Muslims absolutely loathed him. He had a reputation for violence which was unprecedented. And one of his great adventures was to actually attack the heart of Islam. And he was also extremely ruthless and adventurous character. At best, you could call him piratical. That's a good word for him, but he was also extremely ruthless, merciless even in his treatment of Muslims. And his big adventure was to start lead a campaign which was going to strike at the heart of Islam, and the Muslims thought it was going to go down the Red Sea to Mecca and beyond and dig up the tomb of Muhammad and desecrate it. So when after he in fact survived this episode, all his crew members were captured, but he survived. He did this after 16 years in prison. He was held in a Muslim prison for 16 years. So this was what really antagonized him, drove him almost psychotic in his determination to destroy Islam and to do anything he possibly could to hurt Islam. And Saladin swore that he would personally behead him if he ever captured him. And this is what happened after the absolutely crucial Battle of Hattin in 1187, when he captured Raynald, and in a famous confrontation with the king, Guy de Lusignan, after the battle, he beheaded Raynald personally. They say it was probably, one doesn't know whether it was him. He personally beheaded him, but he had him beheaded, certainly. And all the illustrations show him personally cutting off the head of Raynald. And that was, there was no mercy to be shown there, for sure.
I don't know if you know that famous movie. It's called Kingdom of Heaven, I believe. Have you
Kingdom
seen
of
it?
Heaven, yeah.
Yeah. There's also it's shown.
Him cutting off the head of Raynald. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also shown that Reynald, I think, did he murder like Saladin's sister or something along the lines of that?
He murdered quite a lot of people along the way. But he must have had a certain charm, because he married the princess of Tyre and became the local king, as it were. And then he inherited a huge fortress called Kerak down on Gulf of Aqaba, and he was holed up there for a long time. Couldn't be shifted until he took part in the Battle of Hattin.
Yeah. What I also found interesting is what you wrote about his life before he went in prison for 12 years. That he even like attacked Cyprus, if I can remember correctly.
He did attack Cyprus. He wanted cash at the time. His attack on Cyprus was extremely devastating. He destroyed monasteries, he killed nuns, and came away with a great deal of treasure, which stood him in good stead later on, but certainly didn't do his reputation any good.
No, for sure not. I think it's one of those very cool rivalries, and I'm happy Saladin won eventually. I think to really like understand a character, someone's childhood is also very important. What do we know about Saladin's childhood? Do we know if he had any mentors, or like what was his childhood like?
Well, his start was very chaotic to start with, because he was born a Kurd. He wasn't Arab. It wasn't Arabic. But he was taken by his father to Baalbek in the early stages of his life, and that's where he had his childhood, about which very little is known. But he did, by happy chance, this is another quality of leadership, of many leaders, that you need a lot of good luck. And his father worked with, you might say, a warlord who, Nur al-Din, who became a leader of that part of the Arab world. And so that by the time that Saladin, his name was not Saladin, by the way, it was Yusuf. And Saladin he acquired that name after some of his successes. Saladin al-Din, he was Yusuf al-Din originally. By the time he was a teenager, he was very well placed to learn the art of leadership and to see what his objective should be in life. And the objective for him, and indeed all other Muslims at the time, was to throw out the Crusaders.
So he kind of got his life goal, you could say, from his childhood, from his environment.
From his environment and from his contacts. Those successful people often need a mentor, as is recognized by modern leadership theory. And his mentor was Nur al-Din, who was a leader of the Sunnis. Not, of course, that there was a unification of the Sunnis, but at least he was a powerful leader and a good mentor for Saladin.
And do you think what do you think are like the most important things that Saladin learned from Nur al-Din?
Certainly the significance of Islam, certainly the significance of the need to destroy the Crusaders, but also the qualities of leadership which were necessary in order to survive at all in those extremely antipathetic times. There was a lot of rivalry between the various cities, and Nur al-Din was a master craftsman in terms of acquiring cities and influence. And when he died, it gave Saladin his chance. In fact, before he died, Nur al-Din had put him in charge of, sent him on an expedition to Egypt, and Egypt was his foundation. That was why he saw that it was necessary to unite Shia and Sunni.
Eventually, Saladin basically becomes the ruler of Egypt. He still has a what's it called again? One person higher up on him.
Vizier. Oh, yeah, there was a sultan.
Yeah. Eventually, because that was someone from the Fatima dynasty, right? So descendant
Yes.
of the daughter of Muhammad.
Yes, the Fatimids in Egypt,
Mhm.
followers of the daughter-in-law of Muhammad, and her husband Ali. So they were called the Shiite Ali, the party of Ali.
What was Saladin's motivation to get rid of them?
The main aim was for him to take over Egypt. He was able to do that by well. It happened when he was a young leader who died at the age of 19. The Caliph in Baghdad was going to be put into the Friday prayers, replacing the Caliph in Cairo, and that would, in effect, give Saladin the authority of the Caliph in Baghdad to rule in Egypt.
Okay. Because that was one thing I didn't really understand while reading your book is why, because it seems so like Saladin has so many Muslim virtues. Like, why would he get rid of the Caliph?
In Egypt, he got rid of the Caliph because he wanted to rule there. Basically, he wanted to rule in the name of Nur al-Din when Nur al-Din was alive. And after his death, he was able to rule on his own account. But in order to stay there, he needed the unity of Shia and Sunni, but the east and west Muslim lands.
And what was Saladin's relationship like with non-Muslim leaders?
At the time, the whole area was a sort of a nightmare, a billiards table, if you like, of various competing entities, not only Shia and Sunni, but also the local leaders of the Muslim world. The Crusaders were not unified. There were 4 Crusader states. To the north, there was the Turks were coming into what is now Turkey, taking over the Byzantine Empire, which was Christian, which was divided from the Roman Empire, which was also supposedly Christian. And the two were, all of these entities were rivals and traitors with each other. And that also applied to the Christian states themselves. 4 of them were obviously enemies to the Muslim world, but they'd been there a century, and there was a sort of accommodation. There was trade between them. There was not intermarriage, but there was a lot of intermarriage between the Christian states, and all of these needed somehow to be coped with by any leader who was trying to set themselves up in the Muslim world. So the relationship between them was both antipathetic and sometimes they were occasional allies. And the whole business of cooperating and competing between them was extremely complicated, and you needed a tremendous political sense in order to survive at all.
Okay. Yeah, I can imagine. Like, even though there is this religious difference, there's still a need to trade with each other, right? Because that one person has the bread that is needed, the other person has the wool that is needed or whatever. Like trade was still needed even though the religions were different, I can imagine.
Yes, that's true.
To go more the military route, we've talked about the good things Saladin has done, but there were also a couple setbacks, right? Military setbacks. How did Saladin react to those?
He was extremely patient as a leader, and he was not suicidal by any means, so that he retreated and licked his wounds and recovered and retained his vision. There were one or two famous defeats, especially after Hattin. I mean, he had a few setbacks on his rise to power, but there was a major one immediately after his great success on the halls of Hattin in 1187, when he was aiming to achieve the freedom of Jerusalem. Well, after he managed to free Jerusalem, Richard I of England came in to aid the Crusader states, and basically Saladin was unable to complete his ambition. He could not drive the Crusaders out completely, and eventually had to settle for a truce.
And his reaction to that was, what I read in your book, is that he was quite, he did like damage control on his image, you could say. Like he knew the power of an image, right? So he knew the power of marketing and propaganda, whatever. So he didn't really let the people know that it was a defeat, right?
And this is a tactic that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. But since he himself had survived, he was able to present it as some sort of not a defeat, not a victory, but that he would live and fight another day. And he was able to retain the loyalty of his people and retrieve him and basically come back again and regain the loyalty of his people and his troops.
Is that a trick you also see with Genghis Khan? The not admitting defeat?
Genghis
Genghis has never lost.
Well, he was once in Afghanistan.
Okay.
Actually, it wasn't he himself who was defeated. It was one of his sons. So he said that was a big lesson for his son, but he himself was not defeated. I mean, the thing about Genghis was that he went from victory to victory. The final defeat of the Mongols wasn't until long after his death.
That's fascinating. And the Jerusalem, eventually he is able to conquer it. And what he does, as in like how he handles the people, could you tell me something about that?
One of his visions was that he would retake Jerusalem and inflict on it the sort of damage that the First Crusade had inflicted almost 100 years before. And this devastation of Jerusalem was well remembered at the time, because basically kids had their grandfathers tell them about it. And there had been murder on a massive scale, complete destruction of anything Muslim, takeover by the Christians, and memories of that were the worst thing you could possibly imagine. And Saladin had sworn that he would inflict upon the Christians precisely the fate that they had inflicted on the Muslims almost a century before. In fact, what happened was that he went into negotiation with the Christians, persuaded himself that he didn't need to inflict that sort of a damage, and signed a truce whereby the Christian population was allowed to leave on payment of a certain amount of money and all the treasure. But the lives were saved, and this was an expression of Islamic mercy which redounded to his reputation. He came out of it extremely well. In terms of Muslims. There were those, of course, who said that he should have inflicted the punishment that the Christians deserved. But he knew, as Genghis in fact knew, that in the end you have to almost certainly work with your enemies in some way, and that therefore you will need some sort of a good reputation in order to deal with.
And is this also the reason why he's still seen as quite a positive figure from the Christian perspective?
Because of his generosity of spirit, and because of various chivalric actions that he took during battles. For instance, he sent in a battle with Richard I, he sent a horse when he heard that Richard had fallen off, in order that he could act in a royal way, if you like, from one king to another. The Christian world saw him as something of a hero, and also because they justified his success with a sort of a logic, namely that Christians, the argument being that Christians had not been good enough, and therefore God was punishing them. Therefore, in some sense, Saladin was a Christian in disguise, and that he could be worshipped as a hero, be admired as a hero. And he remained something of a hero in the Christian world from then onwards. I might point out that the same argument was made by Muslims when Genghis Khan and the Mongols attacked. Genghis apparently stood up in front of a Muslim crowd and said, "You must have committed great sins in order for me to be inflicted upon you."
That is one of the coolest lines I've heard ever in history. That must be like scary to hear once being conquered. You just mentioned also Richard the Lionheart. Eventually, him and Richard, they kind of have their own rivalry. What would you say is what was like the biggest challenge for Saladin to defeat Richard?
Acre is a very difficult city to take, because it was the end of a causeway which could be easily defended, and because it was on a peninsula which could be easily also resupplied by sea. So hard to take. Richard came. There was a big confrontation. Saladin realized he wasn't going to be able to take Acre. He was thrown back, and Richard came out and started an advance down the coast in order to reach the city of Jaffa. Shielded, mirrored his progress south, being followed by Saladin inland, and the two were not able to inflict any damage on each other, and eventually there was a standoff. Neither was able to defeat the other, and eventually they both, out of sheer exhaustion, made the peace of Jaffa, which allowed Richard to get back home. He needed to get back home because John, his brother, was rivaling him for the throne. And of course, on his way home, he was kidnapped, and then supposedly rescued by found by his minstrel, who was supposedly singing a song outside the castle, to which he responded. Absolute rubbish, of course, the whole story. But he was ransomed with an enormous ransom, called the Saladin tithe, actually, raised in England, which allowed his captors in Durnheim to let him free. So
you kidnapped
there was a standoff between the two. There was no victor.
Okay, there was no victor. And did this create like a mutual respect among both of them? Like, oh, like I know I'm great, but the fact that I couldn't defeat you shows that you're also a person who is great, you could say?
Well, I think they certainly respected each other, because Richard was he was called the Lionheart, and he was certainly a great leader. In his 30s, extremely good looking, flaming red hair, and a terrific fighter as well. And Saladin respected that, and he respected Saladin, who'd been successful on the horns of Hattin. I would say, I mean, I can summarize what I think his qualities were. The ruthlessness we talked about. He was perfectly capable of killing prisoners when necessary, but also capable of releasing them. So there was a generosity of character there, and also a political awareness, a deviousness, but which allowed him to negotiate with leaders of cities and take them over in the early stages of his career. His focus on the destruction of the Christians, his need of a mentor. He had his mentor in Nur al-Din, and his good luck, and a sense of drama as well. He knew how to play the crowd, if you can put it like that.
Like a storyteller.
Well, true. He liked his own myth as much as anything. That's an important element in his leadership. And he was a master of restraint as well. He didn't rush into things. He waited. He was a master of inactivity when necessary.
Are those, you think, like the biggest lessons modern leaders can learn from Saladin?
Well, all of these qualities are qualities of leadership, which I think are appreciated, certainly would be appreciated by modern CEOs. I think perhaps the most difficult thing for any CEO to get, any leader to get nowadays, is a sense of vision and to know what it is you're trying to achieve. I don't know if you've ever been in a managerial role, but managing is simple. Leadership at that sort of level is quite rare.
Yeah, I think that's what you will also see with Saladin, as he's able to motivate his men because he has such a clear vision. Like he's able to like really express it with his army and his population. And it's something you also see with someone like Steve Jobs, for instance. Like he has like a clear vision of what he wants, and that's why it's like nearly infectious, you could say.
I think
And
that's
Saladin
true.
had that with Jerusalem.
You said it very well.